I titled this From Ruts to Relief with the idea that so much of burnout feels overwhelming because we get stuck in a rut and can't figure out how to move forward to relief. And there really is some science behind this. And so I wanted to take some time to go over that today. So my name is Tracy Jackson. I actually went the very typical medical school route. I'm board certified in anesthesiology and pain medicine and addiction medicine. And along the way, also became certified as a health and wellness coach. And I didn't know that that was actually a thing, but it turns out that there is science behind behavioral change. And there's a way to facilitate that that is based in strong scientific evidence and standardized in a way that makes it effective, especially for making difficult changes and improving our health and wellness. I have spent most of my career, I spent about a decade at Vanderbilt where I was on faculty there in pain medicine, and I created and directed the pain fellowship training program, so training other pain doctors. I was really knee deep in research and presentations as you are in an academic career, and ultimately now left to found this company, Relief Retreats, based on what I ultimately learned were my values of learning and authenticity, and I will come back around to that later. Also, I think what is important to know is my own personal burnout journey, and my pathway through medicine has been atypical to say the least. I started out as a surgeon, but I left my 5-year surgery internship after just 1 year from what was pretty classically described burnout, working 120 hours a week, every other night in-house call, just really not a sustainable thing. And I went and took a year off and waited tables after that before I switched to anesthesiology, where interestingly, although the hours were not that much better, I tended to thrive. And then went into private practice and left after a year. Also, quite a lot of time responsibility, but interestingly, for me, a lack of what I perceive to be a challenge or anything much new to learn in that scenario. And there was some personnel stress at that time. At which point I moved to Vanderbilt, and I've stayed there for a long time. And at first was really satisfied with the position because I was building a program. It was an expanding sort of department. And I ultimately actually was able to craft a schedule where I was working a month on and month off. I was really only working 3 or 4 days a week. There was really no reason for me to be burned out at all, but I was absolutely miserable in that job, and my body was starting to really scream at me, and I could not figure out why that was until I actually did the training to become a health coach and received coaching myself. And during that time really had this epiphany about why throughout my career I had been unable to just get in one place and stay that way. And it turned out that once I figured out through coaching about my core values of learning and authenticity, I really changed my whole life around in order to live in an aligned way with those. And so I moved full time into a van where I live now. You may be able to see it behind me. And I had a totally new approach to my career, to building and evolving these relief retreats, where I now sort of don't even identify as a doctor anymore, but really am more of a coach, which is translating and educating and supporting transformation in other people. And it all started with my understanding of pain. And I think to give you some background, I'm going to explain this to you guys as well. So fundamentally, we think of pain as being a sensation from injured structures in our body, and surely that is part of what pain is. It's sensory information coming from these injured structures in our body, but those sensations have to go up and be processed in our brain. This red line represents consciousness. So above this, our cortex, you might hear it referred to as cortical. Part of the brain, and then below that, the more subconscious or subcortical parts of the brain. So the common descriptions of pain in neuroscience tend to focus on this lizard brain, mammalian brain, thinking brain, fight or flight, sort of arbitrary binary constructs of the way the brain works. And that is just really an overly simplistic view about what happens, but there certainly is some benefit in conceptualizing the brain for what it is, which is a giant threat detection system. So the brain is really there in order to keep the organism alive. So anything that signals threat to the brain is going to subconsciously activate all of the pathways and coordinate all of your primitive systems together in order to respond to that threat and store signals about that threat such that you can respond more quickly and efficiently the next time. On the other side of that, the brain also has pathways that respond to safety to balance that out. And anything that is perceived as a threat is essentially going to act like an up knob on your threat thermostat in the brain. And anything that's perceived as safety is going to be dialing that knob down. So whether it is a sensation coming in from an injured tissue in the body, whether it is a threatening person, place, or situation in front of you, whether it's a memory of a past threatening person, place, or situation, whether it's an emotion like fear, anger, or anxiety, whether it is negative stories or thought processes in your conscious or cortical brain above that line, whether it's something toxic you breathe in, like a virus from your environment, whether it's something that you ingest in your diet, all of these things can signal threat and dial up the intensity of anything coming from an injury in your body, which is why pain is not just directly proportional to the injuries that you have in the body or the findings you have on the MRI, but it's that sensation plus or minus what that threat thermostat does in the brain. And so understanding this about pain helped me to really start to notice a phenomenon that is known in the pain world as central sensitization, that when this threat detection system gets stuck on high for whatever reason for any of those inputs, you all of a sudden start getting symptoms in multiple different areas of the body. You get pain in your back, you get migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue, all of these sorts of things that fundamentally imply that the brain is stuck on high alert. And as I started to teach this to the residents and fellows in my role at Vanderbilt and started to notice it happening over and over in my patients, it also started to dawn on me that this is what was happening to me as well in a sort of different setting. And so when you look at central sensitization, it's a combination of two things in the brain. It's like the gas pedal of threat gets stuck, like your foot's on the gas pedal, but there's also essentially pain breaks in your brain, and those become dysfunctional as well. So you've got more stimulus in terms of exciting these threat pathways in the brain, and you have less of what calms it down. And that's what leads to all these different problems. And in our healthcare system, you tend to go to a bunch of different doctors for all these different symptoms, and that is fundamentally a very inefficient and ineffective way to treat it. So overall, just to simplify this, the way I think about it and teach it is essentially your brain is always asking one question: am I safe in this moment, yes or no? And your experience of pain is really just a differential between threat signals and safety signals at its core, and that's obviously oversimplified. So when I started to look at burnout, the WHO defines burnout as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic, unmanageable workplace stress. And it's characterized by these three dimensions. One is exhaustion, and we all know that symptom, which is energy depletion that rest or sleep doesn't feel like it repairs. A type of cynicism and depersonalization, as it's called, where you have this mental distance between yourself and your emotions, which is also known as alexithymia. So you're feeling emotions, but you're also very distant from them at the same time. And it's often coupled with a negativism towards your work, which is very unsettling for people, especially when their work has been their source of identity. And then there is this inefficacy, this reduced sense of accomplishment and effectiveness, that you're working harder but for less results. The very interesting thing about burnout is 10 years ago, there was not even any discussion that it was a medical condition, that it was just purely an occupational phenomenon. But the neuroscience, it turns out, is unambiguous, that there are things that are happening in your brain when you're burned out. And this is a paper from 2025, of a review paper that took all of the MRI findings of every study in burnout, both the sort of natural history of burnout and the treatments for burnout. And the results of this, the summary was that modern neuroimaging repeatedly shows that chronic occupational stress leaves unmistakable fingerprints on the brain. So your core emotional processing hubs, like the amygdala, especially in women, and the amygdala is what's thought as our sort of fight or flight system. You hear that in sort of the lay discussion about this. But fundamentally, it's a heightened reactivity to threat over time with burnout. So more threat causes your brain to become on higher alert for more threat, right? If you're attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, your brain is going to all of a sudden think that there's a possibility of a saber-toothed tiger everywhere. So there's this increased reactivity to threat the more chronically you're exposed to it. On top of that, there's another part of the brain that essentially are part of the pain breaks that get abnormally functional and blunt this cognitive control. There are other parts of the brain that shrink, which slow thought and action. And then there is this idea of compassion fatigue. There's something about burnout that people feel like is just you're giving and empathetic and you can't give any more. But it turns out in burned out brains, there's actually lower activity in your empathetic circuits. And that reflects almost like this negative feedback loop that in order to protect yourself, your brain puts distance between you and other people, and you begin to have even difficulty identifying and processing those emotions. When that starts to happen, there are also very well described chronic health implications. There are higher risk of diabetes, heart disease, depression, anxiety, suicidality, and all sorts of pain, including all of those central sensitization types of pain in people with burnout, to the point that there's a 35% risk higher all-cause mortality in workers who are under the age of 45. So together, these findings really emphasize that burnout is dangerous for your health. It's not just overwhelming. It's not just something that you're working too hard, but it actually is creating and maintaining these threat pathways that are putting your very health at risk in very significant ways. And so when I think about burnout and what it is really, it feels like all these things: dreading work you used to love. It feels like emotional exhaustion that rest doesn't fix. It feels like cynicism and detachment, that depersonalization, loss of meaning, reduced effectiveness despite working harder and adding more self-care, these physical symptoms and feeling trapped. But what's really happening is your nervous system is stuck in this threat mode, and the brain's alarm circuits are chronically activated, and the calming pathways are essentially just suppressed. And the thing about it is you're not broken. This is not a brokenness. This is not an illness that is happening because something is wrong with your brain. It's your body and brain faithfully, appropriately responding to this chronic threat signal. So it's a biological state. It's not actually a moral failing. And so this same threat safety thermostat idea that was applied all these years for pain is really the same with burnout. Just fundamentally thinking, where is the threat? Where is the safety? And the difference between those is what people are neurobiologically experiencing as burnout. And part of the problem is we work so much of our waking day and then expect a fraction of forced resting or calming activities to sort of negate 16 hours of these chronic threat signals. And it turns out threat signals, there's absolutely no question in the literature that organizational factors make a huge difference in burnout. When my first experience with general surgery, you can't ask someone to work 120 hours a week and then tell them to meditate or quit their job. These things aren't options. And so the sort of extraction of labor from workplaces is a very real contributor to burnout. And so it's not fair to tell people just to work on themselves without also acknowledging that these organizational factors play a big role. That being said, there are also lots of things about the way we interface with systems that we can't change that turn the threat signal up even more. So take what we're experiencing in our workplace and then amplify the sensory input related to that. And so some of those things are values misalignment. So basically what you really believe in, what you consider to be the foundational principles through which you like to live and view the world and behave, those are misaligned either at your work, in the relationships, either at work or at home, just in how you live. Persistent fear of any sort, anxiety, anger, grief, shame, all of that is going to turn threat up. So will toxic relationships, workplace dynamics, being othered, feeling that you don't belong in a group. Certainly sleep deprivation, physical inactivity, isolation and loss of community, trauma, and interestingly, a ton of information about negative self-talk and identity fusion with either your pain or your job that is perceived as a source of suffering. Whenever your identity fuses in any way with a source of suffering, that becomes this self-perpetuating feed-forward neurobiological threat loop in the brain. So whether it's burnout or pain, all these things amplify the threat circuits in the brain, the threat thermostat. With pain and burnout, all these things also reliably turn it down. So living in alignment with your core values, which we'll talk about more in a second, finding safe, supportive people and communities, a sense of awe, joy, wonder, being in nature is a good way to do that, regular movement. And I would say that out of all of the interventions for pain, burnout, any other chronic illness, movement is the number one. And for all chronic health decisions or conditions. And part of that is just thinking from the perspective of evolution. An animal that is not working, not moving, is a survival risk, right? So any body that is not moving is going to significantly and intensely amplify the threat circuits in the brain. So regular movement is one of the key things across the board in all chronic illness that turns the threat thermostat down. Then there's sleep, self-compassion and kind internal language, and creative engagement. So fundamentally, there is a rule in neuroscience called Hebb's law that is what wires together. So any part of your brain that you use frequently is going to become thicker, more efficient, more numerous neurons than those parts of the brain that you don't use. So sort of where your attention goes, your energy flows. What you do, what you say, what you think, all of those things matter in terms of creating new neurons or sort of pruning away the ones that are not as useful. So fundamentally, I think of it as these ruts in your brain and this grassy driveway. So many of us have these very well rutted out threat pathways in our brain. And you can do things like pills and procedures for pain and self-care and all this kind of stuff, which is like putting a gate up over those rutted out pathways in the brain. But if you don't take the time to actually create new driveways in the grassy field of your brain, then when the going gets rough, you just sort of always default to these rutted out pathways. That being said, a huge growing body of evidence shows that all of these sort of functional structural abnormalities change. That is the basis of what is known as neuroplasticity. And so wherever you are now is not where you ever have to be. And so it really has to do with the inputs that you give to your brain from here on out, what happens. And this is fundamentally how I think of this and describe this to patients in the past and how I think about it in my own life. Let's say that you need 100 inputs into your brain before the whole thing becomes sort of stuck and sensitized and everything feels like it's all going to hell. So some people start out sort of genetically behind the 8 ball, and we won't talk about that today, but there are certainly some genetic predispositions to having facilitation of these threat pathways. Some people have pretty rough childhoods, so childhood trauma is again another thing that can predispose people to having increasing numbers and efficiency of neurons in the threat pathways. And again, this was to keep you safe. This is the brain trying to keep you safe appropriately. So it's not that your brain is broken, it's just what your brain needed to do at that time to keep you alive and safe. Still, some kids will start to develop tummy aches, headaches, some of those same central sensitization symptoms as kids. But for most people, they don't develop the central sensitization until this first big stressful job or their first big injury or something like that. And then they notice all of a sudden they're not sleeping, they're anxious, work feels really overwhelming. But then there's a party and they feel better, and then they go back to work and they feel worse, and they fall in love and they feel better, and they have kids and they feel worse. And most people can tell a time in their trajectory of life or work or relationships where there were good days and bad days, but they kept it under control. Then what happens is there's an additional sort of insult. You divorce, you get fired from a job, something, and then the things you used to do for self-care to sort of manage things don't work anymore. And this is where this sort of spiral starts to happen, because it's sort of like an all or nothing thing in the brain once there's central sensitization. So all of a sudden, now you're trying to drink the beer or take the vacation and nothing is really working. And so then your brain starts to panic. Is this the way my life is always going to be? Am I always going to be in pain? Am I always going to be stuck in this burned out job, this dead end relationship? And then you end up way up there at 500 inputs and feel really broken, and that nothing's going to work and no doctors are helping and nothing is helping and this is just the way it's going to be. But you are not broken, never. Your brain is resilient. It is doing exactly what it's supposed to do in times of extreme physical and psychological stress. The issue is if you're up here at 500 inputs and you do yoga for 3 months, you might feel better in the moment, but fundamentally nothing feels like it's changing. And then you become demoralized again and still stressed and overwhelmed, and you quit doing it and your inputs go back up to 500. Or maybe you take a vacation or go in nature and it maybe helps a little bit, but you don't really notice a huge difference because you're still way up above the threshold. So what I tell people is there is no magic thing that is going to turn the volume down for any one person. It is just a matter of not thinking in terms of 2 weeks or 2 months of change, but knowing that anything that creates a sense of safety is going to be dialing down that volume. So whether it's finding a community, whether it's exercising, whether it's changing your diet, one day, if you just keep with it and trust that things are changing, you will drop below that line. It is, however, a combination not just of adding more things to push you down below that line, removing some of the things that are creating the threat in the first place. That is where it's going to be most effective. So just like in pain, and this is a summary from that paper on burnout, the safest conclusion is that burnout does alter brain anatomy, but not in a single linear one-size-fits-all fashion. And this is exactly the same with chronic pain. There is no one-size-fits-all thing that is going to work for pain, because what dialed up your threat thermostat is not going to be what dialed up anybody else's threat thermostat. And what dials it down will not be that either. So different circuits are going to follow distinct time courses. There are other things like sleep and sex hormones and inflammatory tone may tilt effects one way or the other. And what looks like a contradiction in cross-section can resolve into a predictable sequence in a longitudinal big picture astronaut's view. And so this is the big picture astronaut's view. So how do you get from here to there without getting overwhelmed by all the different options? What is the right option for me? And the thing to understand is that how the brain wires is universal, meaning that if you have threat in your brain, it is going to predictably activate and strengthen certain circuits in the brain. And if you have safety, is going to predictably activate those other pathways. So how that works is universal. But what the brain wires is as specific to you as a fingerprint. And it has always been since the time you were born. Your brain, and it's really fascinating with mapping of the brain with artificial intelligence now, how specific and utterly unique these brain maps of pain and suffering are becoming. And what is beautiful is that once you start to understand how that works and focus in on what is actually specifically creating threat for you, then a whole world opens up of options that you can cater specifically for you. And what I use to sort of help people figure out what that is, based on my experience with pain and actually also with substance use, both personally and professionally working with people with addiction and with burnout, is what I've called the trust pathway. And what trust stands for is tether to your values. So knowing who you are beyond whatever is causing your suffering. R is remove and reframe. So you've got to take your foot off the gas pedal before you can press the brakes. So you as unwind, but so often what I see is that people burned out are really stuck here trying to force themselves to unwind, when in reality, the brain is not going to let you unwind if it is unsafe to do so, right? So you have to work on removing what is triggering you before your brain is actually going to effectively let you rest. And this is why so much burnout comes from this wired exhaustion, where you're always tired, but you're never rested. And this is because the threat is always there and you're trying to force it to go away rather than allowing your brain to unwind when it knows it's safe to do so. And then the S and T of the pathway are really strengthening, which is building capacity right where you are, building skills and tools to help you on this sort of long-term path, moving yourself down below that threshold. And then the T for travel is essentially building resilience for the real world. It doesn't mean getting on a plane, but just how do you take these skills and go out into situations and know you'll be able to handle whatever's thrown at you. And so today, just for the next few minutes that we have here, the T is really the most important. And the reason it's the first letter and the foundation to everything else is that once you understand why you do anything, it does not matter where you go, how you get there. If you can understand the lens that you're using to view the world and the compass that you're using to direct yourself, which is essentially your values, then everything else sort of falls into place. Knowing that you are moving towards your light, moving towards something positive and aspirational and inspirational to you, the very core thing that makes you, that creates a sense of safety, inspiration, energy, motivation in the brain. You're activating the pathways in your brain that are opposite of the negative pathways. If you're focusing on whatever is wrong in your life and all the things that you hate and you want to change, that is continuing to give attention and intention pathways in the brain oxygen, essentially, to grow and stay rutted out. But in reality, if you figure out two things, not 20 things, but two things, and it took me a month. So it's not something that's necessarily very obvious. But once you figure out what those foundational two core values are, you will understand so clearly. It's actually amazing why your job is soul crushing, why the relationship is fraught, why the healthcare system traumatizes you. So you get in the situation where you don't feel like you've got to just abandon your relationships, leave your job, throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? It gives you a way to understand specifically what is rubbing up against your values so you can triage the overwhelm and transform it from everything is wrong into here's the mismatch and here's what I can do about it. So with that lens of curiosity based in looking forward to your aspirational values, then you don't have to be reactive and defensive. You move forward in a way that's proportionate and strategic and is fundamentally exciting to you. And people ask all the time, how can I tell my value is really a value and not just something that maybe my value is serenity because I'm so sick of living in chaos, right? But maybe that's not really my value. Or maybe my value is kindness, but I really only care about kindness if other people like the fact that I'm kind and are nice to me and make my life easier because I'm kind. And the difference is that a value don't care who sees you. When you're acting in accordance with that value, you could do it in the woods, in the middle of a forest with nobody looking. If your value is creativity, you would create art even if nobody thought it was good, even if people said it was a waste of time. It was just something that was who you are, central to who you are. My values, like learning and authenticity, I could be anywhere in the world by myself and not care one thing whether anybody thought what I was doing was useful or interesting or a waste of time. If I am learning something, I am in the zone, and fundamentally there's nowhere else I would rather be. So these are the core ways to determine what your values are. And they're not the same thing as beliefs. And we talked about this in the worksheet, but Beliefs tell you what to think. They're inherited and debated and defended, and they fundamentally can divide. A lot of people can believe in God, but there's a lot of fighting among people who say that they believe in God, right? And so there are lots of different meanings to beliefs and why people think that. Beliefs are just they're opinions essentially, but values are why you believe the things that you do. They are the deeper, stable, unifying things that unite you. And then you can have people that believe in God and don't believe in God, but if their values underneath are kindness, for instance, then they are going to really bond and the beliefs won't make as much difference. So values help organize your life too, organize your relationships, your peer groups, where you spend your time, because when you are with value-aligned people, that is a fundamental safety signal all the way around. Once you know those values, then it becomes really easy to actually look at your life and your work and figure out what you can remove and what you can reframe, right? You can't remove racism or other cultural things from your environment, for instance. But you can set boundaries, remove and notice values, contrary situations in people. You can notice negative and self-defeating talk. You can notice if there are substances, for instance, that are producing intoxication, trying to slam you down into rest when you're still being threatened from other sources. Just notice that. There's also this idea of the circle of concern versus the circle of influence, right? If you're spending your time concerning yourselves with things in your workplace or the culture that you cannot change, and yet you don't have any influence over that, then that is going to create a threat signal in that gap. So what you can remove, you remove, and what you can't, you begin to reframe. And that goes from, some examples of that are my body is broken, something's wrong with me, to my body is protecting me, or this job sucks, I can't handle it, to this particular aspect of my job is expensive for my nervous system. Another thing that a psychologist did when I led a retreat with some pain patients, which was just truly miraculous how much it could transform in 2 weeks, is if you hear yourself saying things like always or never, and that catastrophizing thought is a clear sign of central sensitization in most brains. But if you hear yourself saying those words, you just add until now to the end. I always end up coming home from work tired until now. So it gives you a sense of cognitive flexibility that there may be hope. And the same goes for changing the word but to and. I want to go to my kid's baseball game, but I have pain. I want to go to my kid's baseball game and I have pain. I want to leave this, I hate this job, but I need the money. I hate this job and I need the money. So it becomes a way for you to increase cognitive flexibility. The fundamental idea behind that is that curiosity is the antidote to fear in the brain. You cannot be curious about what's going on and have cognitive flexibility and live in fear at the same time. Those threat circuits don't really overlap. So language seems very simple, but it's something that when practiced over and over can help activate those circuits. And then for the you, it's just creating pockets of genuine safety so your nervous system knows when it's safe to wind down. And it just begins by noticing when you're trying to sleep, what is keeping you from doing that? When you're trying to rest, what is getting in the way? And looking at it again with curiosity, not with I should do this, I can't do this, I'm never able to do this, but just noticing what delights you, what enchants you. Is it a sunset? Is it the color blue? Are there things around you right now that are free that you can access wherever you are that can create a sense of just natural safety? And the first step in unwinding, especially when you haven't removed or reframed or know exactly what your values are, is just noticing where you have that naturally instead of trying to add more things on a nervous system that is already overwrought and feels like there's no more time to do that. So the last two are where the sort of quick fix American mentality butts up against reality. And there really is no quick fix for these things. And this is where coaching really comes in, where accountability and support and values aligned communities can really help you achieve your goals. It's the difference between people giving up on all their New Year's resolutions within 8 weeks and people actually making change that sticks. And it starts with wherever you are, strengthening your capacity for discomfort, right? Building resources, whether that's through movement, communication, identity work, trauma processing, substance use, so that you have more to work with today, right where you are when things are hard. And this is where the big levers of health live. This is where when you start to address them, not just does your burnout get better, but your pain gets better, your sleep gets better, your mood gets better, your blood pressure gets better. These are big levers, but they are also notoriously intensive to change. Once you have started to do that, right, and a lot of people, again, do that way earlier in the pathway. They start to try to get an exercise program in when they're so overwhelmed that that just feels like another checkbox on the to-do list and they give up, right? Whereas if you can, for instance, I used to hate exercise. It was one of those things I had to put in there. But when I realized that I could learn something about myself by training. Like, I run a marathon at 50. Like, is that something my body could do? I tell myself I'm not an athlete. Is that even true? And so I turn it into an experiment. And for somebody with a value of learning, that makes it exciting for me to try. And that makes it something that I stick with for a long time. People that have values of community find changes with other people is much more effective for them than trying to do it all by themselves. So this is where values can help with your coach determine how to tackle these hard things. And then the last T is travel. And that's just taking everything you've learned and, into real unpredictable life, just kind of testing and discovering that you can still be okay right now. And community is really important in that box. Last little piece of scientific data here, and this is sort of a couple of systematic reviews of burnout. Here are the factors that predict successful recovery from burnout. And if you'll notice, almost every one of these is addressed in the trust pathway. So the first, and a ton of them on the left, are these internal locus of control. So that's really values alignment. You don't care what anybody else says, what the external world is saying. You know what's right for you and you feel you have control over that. That is what that means. So self-efficacy, resilience, identity reconstruction away from the source of suffering, having some comfort, curiosity with ambiguity, strong social support networks, mentors and coaches, of core values. There's actually a ton of research. I didn't make this up. This was part of the health coaching training, and ton of research about clarity on core values really makes all of this much clearer. Then again, the capacity for reflection, that cognitive flexibility, able to have mastery experiences or flow outside of work. What delights you, what enchants you, what is somewhere where that you can into your values that doesn't have anything to do with what you do for work. And then finally, the practical and financial. And one of the biggest things that holds people back from burnout is people saying, I can't leave the job. I need the money, I need the benefits, I need whatever it is. And one thing that really helps with the values work is noticing where you spend your time and money. Are you spending your money on things that you really value? And when I sat down and looked at that for myself, I have this huge house. Why am I spending all this money on clothes and all these other kinds of things that I need for this job that is actually even draining me? And when I look at all that, and actually for me, minimized everything and moved into a van, my financial advisor tells me I'm working 20% as much, but I save 200% as much, because I'm not spending money on things that don't help me live in an aligned way with my values anymore. So you can actually exist, most people, on a lot less than they think they do, not because they need to make more, but because their spending is more aligned with what's important to them. And most of the things that are fundamentally valued and important to people are free, it turns out. This is also a really good exercise, help people just re-examine where their outputs are. And then the last thing is just articulating your skills and finding networks for those skills moving forward. It's also very clear from the literature that people who successfully navigate major life transitions typically possess most of those capacities before they live. So the decision to blow up your life, if that's something that you are inclined to do with burnout, should ideally come after you've intentionally developed those capacities. So not as a desperate act from complete depletion. So, I threw everything out in the alley in Nashville and sort of moved into a van, but I had been moving towards that for years and years before that, building some of these things. And so the most successful transitions do involve strategic preparation. And even if it takes months or a few years while you remain in that situation, if you are focused on the value, right? If you are focused on where you're going, that is going to energize and inspire you and make you excited to do the work that it takes to get there. Whereas if you are just flailing around in the dark and don't know why you're doing anything, then it's just chaotic and defensive and depleting. So we're getting towards the end here. You're not a diagnosis, you're not a statistic, you're not a score, and you're definitely not your job. You're a human being with a constantly changing, utterly unique nervous system, really utterly unique to you. And it's capable of adaptation and recovery and meaning. And once you dial in with these values, I cannot tell you enough of how patients I've seen with pain and addiction and burnout intuitively know what will work for them. Why all the other stuff that has been recommended to them by other people or other experts has made no sense and didn't work for them in the first place. So it really gives you power to understand, clarity and power to understand what the right path is for you. And that makes it even more effective because behavioral science of behavioral change really says that people don't fundamentally change and stay changed unless it's their idea. So, a coach will help you figure out what your idea is and then help you experiment and get there. And, the difference, it's a matter of living like you're dying instead of dying like you're living. So hopefully from this, you have the core values clarity worksheet and you're now inspired, if you hadn't already, to figure out what those values are. And then this week, you can just notice what values violate or turn your threat up and what brings it down, and just begin to sort of notice with curiosity what comes up. And then is an opportunity to understand how you strengthen and learn to travel. And that's where coaching comes in. And so this is going forward, what I offer is there'll be a peer group coaching program. So if your values suggest that you heal better in community, and most people do, particularly with burnout, be doing a group coaching support group and education sort of every week for 12 weeks beginning in June. And then there's also for individual support or even just a worksheet, a more extensive worksheet to go through this values exercise. And so if you're interested in any of that, you can go to the website or you can send me a note on social media or any of those sorts of things.